Thank you all for coming. My name is Brian Doyle. I am the director for the Center for Ethical Concerns. I'll give you a little idea of what we're doing here. Let me first, I'll allow the presenters to introduce themselves. Eric Bubar, who is also going to be presenting, but is also right now presenting on 3D imagery printing in another room. So when he's done with that, he will come rolling in here around 11:30. So it'll seem rude, but that's what happens when you're doing good work. Every year for the last almost 20 years, Marymount has offered 2 faculty seminars in ethics. The first one meets for a week right after graduation, where in the last 15 years or so, Dr. Boylan works them through a set of readings and helps them create a module for their classes, an ethical module. So it would not be for development of an ethics class, but you're teaching a course on criminal justice. Here's how you would develop an ethical unit into that syllabus. And so that's kind of the structure. It's focused primarily on curriculum development and ethical reflection for the faculty member in service of his or her students. Then there's the offer of the second ethics seminar 2, in which faculty are develop their own agenda, their own program. They can work individually or they can work in groups. And they spend not only that summer, but often into the fall and maybe longer working on projects. And they develop different things, and they write reports to me. And what I realized is that these reports came to me. Sometimes they went to the provost, and I presented them to the board of trustees, and the rest of the university maybe never heard about them. And so I wanted to make sure that some of the people who have been, I invited people from the last 2 years, I think, that have done different projects or had different experiences in their ethics 2 year to come to share those with us. So I'm going to allow them to kind of say a little about, I think we said 5 to 7 minutes, kind of what they did, how that worked. What I'm hoping for is that some themes, they're very different disciplines, but I think, as will the scientist who rolls in later, what I think we'll find is that there are some themes, and I'm hoping we tie this some to the identity of Marymount, where ethics stands as one of our hallmarks, but we'll see if that part works out. So we didn't plan in order.
No.
Do you want to just, Holly, you're nodding and have notes? And that's
I have notes. I have notes. I can go first. Well, I brought notes because I did this reading group with Tanya Howe and Bess Fox, and Tanya wrote up this whole...
I think everybody knows you.
Yeah, well, you should know me. I sit on the stage
That's
one
right.
time. I mean,
if you don't know who she is, you're not
Holly
going to faculty council.
Then we have a problem. You're not showing up. So and Tanya wrote up this beautiful introduction to what we were doing. So I brought Tanya's language because she's smarter than all of us put together. So we started with this idea of public humanities and how we help our students connect what they're doing in the classroom with larger social concerns. So here's kind of our foundation for this this readings group. I guess can we call it like a readings group? I mean, that's kind of what we were, yeah. And there's a couple of quotes in here from James Quay and James Veninga discussing the results of the National Task Force on Scholarship and Public Humanities. So the scholarly goals of higher education and public civic engagement often seem to stand opposed, when the truth is that scholarship and public discourse are not 2 distinct spheres, but as parts of a single process, the process of taking private insight, testing it, and turning it into public knowledge. This kind of work connects scholarship to public service and public knowledge with the goal of enriching public conversation and extending participation in this conversation to all. In other words, public humanities is committed to the democratic potential and self and other aware humanistic inquiry. We seek to provide students with inquiry-based education and courses that emphasize close readings of texts, creative research, multimodal writing, and publicly accessible humanistic work. The goal of public humanities is to connect individuals consciously to their lived world. Yet the most momentous challenge facing higher education today is overcoming the sense and practice of a divide between academic scholarship in the humanities and public utility. So we wanted to help overcome that in our classrooms so that students would see those connections more clearly. Literature engaged with public discourse. And we structured our reading around 3 kind of themes based on what we teach. The first is the ethics of reading, and in connection with the ethics of reading, the ethics of teaching reading. The other was the ethics of writing and teaching writing. And I teach creative writing, so I was thinking about both creative discourses that students engage in, and we were also thinking about writing about literary texts, particularly what happens when you write about people who are not you. How does that work ethically? And then the ethics and impact of engaging directly with the community, so community service, service learning kinds of activities. So we had 3 texts: J. Hillis Miller's The Ethics of Reading, Thomas Courser's Vulnerable Subjects, Ethics in Life Writing, and Robert Rhodes' Community Service and Higher Learning, Explorations of the Caring Self. And we had lots of crazy discussions about these texts, which were really formative for me as a teacher in many ways. The direct impact of the reading group was 2 courses. Tanya taught our senior seminar class on crime, critique, ethics, and fiction, and she used particularly a lot of the theories of ethical reading in this course to help students think about what it means to read, especially when we're reading about reprehensible characters, what it means to sort of engage with a text where the protagonist is someone we might not approve of in an ethical sense. And I taught a course, Topics in Creative Writing, Service Learning, and Social Justice. So my goal in the class was to help students connect both the writing, the creative writing that they were doing in the class, and the readings. We did theoretical readings about service learning, but also about issues of social justice, and we also did literary readings, creative writing samples about dealing with themes of social justice. And I was kind of interested in what would happen if I just kind of stuck them in this environment. I didn't have any kind of requirement about what they would write in the class or how they would respond. They just had to do this work and do this service. They did 12 to 15 hours of service. And it was really kind of refreshing. Students were much more likely to write about characters that were not them, or thinly veiled representations of them, like them as a werewolf or them as a mermaid, right? Yes, I get that. So, and even when they wrote about themselves, they were often writing about engaging with the community. They wrote about their service experiences, and they wrote about themselves in unfamiliar circumstances. So it was really interesting. It changed what I got to read in terms of the creative writing sample. For example, there were a couple students who worked with older populations, and one had this really powerful story about an injustice she saw at a nursing home where she was working, where a woman was treated really horribly by one of the staff, and the vulnerability of that woman. She wrote this really powerful essay about witnessing that and about how she was kind of helpless as a volunteer to do a lot about it. Another one wrote, I had a student in there who was a painter, and she worked in a class with Alzheimer's patients, a painting class with Alzheimer's patients. And she wrote about how working with these patients completely transformed her ideas of painting and what it meant to express yourself. So I wanted to read, too, a couple of reflections, because I think what was successful about the class was their ability to bridge that gap between the experiences that they were having both in service and in the classroom. So here's an example. This is from a student who was working with it's AACH, Arlington Alexandria Coalition for the Homeless, which is located in Clarendon. There's one shelter in Clarendon, and it's a shelter for families. And she was working with the kids in after-school programs. She was helping them with their homework. And I'm going to kind of skip around in her narrative, but she says, one Thursday I was helping Miriam, a twin sister, with her homework, and she noticed that the volunteer, the student, noticed that this little girl had a broken shoe, and she made a mark about it, and the student joked, "Oh, it's been broken all day." And she started to think about, I'm kind of skipping around here, what that meant. She said, "These kids go to school every day with other kids whose parents belong to the middle class. They're surrounded by their peers who have more than them. Hazel goes to St. Thomas More Catholic School. I'm sure she sees the difference between her and her peers who have what she doesn't have. She's surrounded by these materialistic children who most likely fall victim to a social barrier because of their parents. Jason Adam Wasserman and others very accurately write about the issue of poverty and wealth in America in the introduction of their book on homelessness, At Home on the Street. It states, U.S. capitalism is characterized not just by the existence of competition, but also by the belief in competition as a mechanism for social progress. Here they suggest that that Americans place a sense of disvalue on those who are incapable of success, and that group of people are the poor. Also in this introduction, they quote the words of Kenneth Kyle, who believes, when used as a filter for viewing individual fortune and achievement, those who are more successful, certainly the homed, are more valued than those who are less successful, clearly the homeless. So she was really making a link between what she saw in the shelter and her students' experiences, and what she imagined their experiences probably were, and what we were reading in the class, which I thought was quite successful. And here's another one from a student who connects both a story that he wrote and a story that we read in class with his experience. And he quotes himself first, and then they're kind of allowed to do that in creative writing classes. And he says, I wrote this short story to represent the misconception many American people have about Latino families. Not all Latinos are dangerous, and in the case of the father in the story I wrote, he is represented as a prejudiced person and not open-minded. In the story Terreno by Zachary Knapp, which is something we read in class, the author represents the landowner as being unjust and not lending the land to Alejandro. The landowner discriminates against Alejandro for not lending him the land. I relate to Zachary because I started volunteering with parents as a translator and later became an activist for Latino families. I volunteered in an elementary school and translated for parents to communicate with their child's teachers. I found that people were treated unequally just because of their race, in this case for being Latinos and not speaking English. I began to realize that many teachers spent a lot of time with other parents and little time with the parents I helped translate. And sometimes I would ask the parents if they had questions for the teachers, but they were all nervous or possibly scared and did not speak up and ask about their children's improvement in school. I began to realize they were not treated equally just because of not speaking English and because they were different. Many of them were illiterate, so that might have been one reason they did not speak up, but others were just scared to ask questions. So, I mean, they were coming to some important realizations in the class, and those realizations were really connected both with the classroom and the larger environment in which we live. And I wish that I could teach the class again, but it was a lot of work. And I will try, because a lot of the students, commented, not just in these reflections, but they commented to me how essential this class was revolving around service learning and how much that really added to what they got out of the class. But it was just, I didn't have a lot of institutional support, so I had to figure out how to get all these students to South Arlington to do, it was kind of crazy, but worth doing, and I hope to do it again at some point. But,
and if I could interrupt, one of the things worth noting to those here is how much of that service you did with them.
Yeah, I did it with them. Yes, yeah. Yes. I worked both at the Arlington Alexandria Coalition for the Homeless that's in here. I had worked there the previous summer just to kind of see what was going on there. And I also worked in South Arlington in a number of after-school programs with my students, partly so that I could drive them there, but also so that I could be part of that experience. And that was really fun too. It's a huge bonding experience with students to engage in a kind of community activity with the students. And I want to talk too a little bit about the class that I'm teaching this semester in senior seminar, but I probably will hold off on that because I've talked quite a lot. So, but I just the point is that what we did in this Ethics 2 reading group spilled over in a variety of interesting ways in my teaching.
Great, thank you, Hal. I appreciate that. Mm-hmm. Nancy, we just go down the line.
Jeez, I feel like a slug. I spent my summer on the beach. I wasn't volunteering, working on research. I'm Nancy Furlow with the School of Business, for those of you who don't know me. With the proposal, the call for proposals had one of the suggested uses of Ethics 2 was to establish a reading group, which I guess is what Holly's group did. And that's what originally I wanted to do. I wanted to do a reading group with other like-minded professors from other disciplines outside of the School of Business, and or within the School of Business as well, but outside of marketing, which is what I teach. And I was told nobody else had that desire, so someone didn't want to play with me. So I did an individual research project, which was really good though, because I needed something to kickstart me back on the research track. I had sort of fallen off of it for a while, so this was really good. And with Michael's help in leading me with the theoretical framework for my research, which has always been my downfall. And so I started off really way out here, and Michael was able to help me to hone it in. And my topic was, I started off looking at corporate social responsibility in the sport industry. Whoa, way out there. And then I ended up honing it down to looking just at sustainability within the sports industry. And that really goes hand in hand with what I'm doing here at Marymount, because I worked very hard to get a sustainability minor going and limping along. But also in my Discover class, the theme of my Discover course is sustainability. And so I'm able to use some of the cases that I've read about while I was doing the research in my class in Discover. And students seem to relate more to the fact that a NHL hockey team actually came out with a report and came out with a statement saying climate change is going to kill the sport because they don't have ice. They can't practice. And putting a dollar value on sustainability but for a major, they were actually the first, I can't remember what team it was, but they were the first one to come out with the sustainability report, and now more and more teams and eventually leagues are doing so. I wish I had notes, because there was something else I was going to say related to that. But no. Oh, and also the research really coincides with what I'm doing, working with the community, and the fact that I'm working with a working group at U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services that's working with the outdoor recreation industry. We have Patagonia, Bass Fishers, all of these big corporations that are on board that are trying to put an economic spin on the cost of sustainability and trying to promote it that way, and for the industry itself. And so the research that I did with Michael's helped to steer me in that direction. I'm still a little bit out there with the theoretical framework. That's always been my theories, but I'm continuing to work on it this semester, and hopefully we'll have something publishable soon. That's it.
Great, thank you. Angel?
I'm Angel Daniels. I'm in the Department of Forensic Psychology. Really, Jen? Really? Okay.
Good timing. And one leaves.
Typical. For my Ethics 2 project, I partnered with Dr. Ioana Boya, who teaches in the Masters of Counseling Community Psych program. And both of us are extremely interested in multiculturalism, cultural competence, and both of us have a really strong passion for the idea of trying to engender global citizenship in young people and in our own selves and in our peers. And one of the things that both of us have talked about struggling with in our classes is how to talk about human rights in a way that isn't coming from a Western bias. The U.S. seems to think that we are the leaders of human rights, that we are the ones who will teach the world how we should be. And not only are we hypocritical a lot of times, but the struggle is, how do we know that we are the right ones? How do we know that we do know what's best for everybody? And so Ioana and I really wanted to look at how do we talk about human rights in a way, how do we talk about universal and global human rights in a way that isn't completely tied to our own Western lens? And that's a really difficult thing to even kind of wrap your mind around sometimes. And Dr. Boya is from Romania herself. She's lived around the world. I've traveled and studied in a couple of different parts of the world, and one of the experiences that I had is really kind of what has fueled this particular question for me. And I was in Uganda for a summer doing research on human trafficking and child soldiering and just kind of exploitation of women and children there. And I visited a organization that was in northern Uganda, which is kind of the war-torn area of Uganda in Gulu. And they were working to reduce or eliminate domestic violence or intimate partner violence in the community. And Uganda is about 50 or 60 years kind of behind us in this way in terms of gender equality and views on that type of thing. And the organization was led by a Ugandan male, and I thought he was great. I listened to his presentations. I was so excited about his passion for this. And then at the end of one of his presentations, he said, the thing that we try to teach the men in the community is before you beat your wives, make sure that they've done something wrong. And I was like, oh, shoot, you had me until the end. And so I really kind of felt super conflicted, because here's somebody who is speaking for progress, that is progress in northern Uganda, but he wasn't reaching my ideals of where they should be. And how did I know that my ideals were the right ideals? How do I know that I should tell him, no, even though you've been working in this field for decades, let me tell you how it should be done? It's kind of this extreme kind of elitism that I realized was part of my own culture. And so kind of bringing that back into the classroom, in forensic psychology, we get to talk about a lot of human rights issues, and we get to talk about a lot of issues of kind of social division and us versus them and the bad guys and the good guys. And what I really try to do is kind of blur those lines for the students, and to make it so that everybody is one of our in-group. And if everybody's one of our in-group, what do we want those values to be? And sometimes by trying to advocate for universal human rights, especially those that are outlined by the UN Declaration of Human Rights, we can actually end up violating the human rights of other people who have a fundamental right to disagree with some of those rights. And so it just becomes this really big, messy kind of like black hole of which way is up and which way is right and which way is wrong. And I don't have an answer for that. Dr. Boya and I, surprisingly, throughout this seminar, did not find the answer.
Hi, I'm really curious that you didn't find anything. And did you look at Paulo Freire's Theory of the Oppressed? Did you look at the CPPR model? I mean, there's a lot out there, actually.
There is.
It's not about, I mean, think about, we do, student-centered education or patient-centered. If it's truly about that, and it's about the community, then you don't have to have the answer. You don't come in with your bias,
right,
but you help facilitate discovery. I just think it's really important that the students don't, we talk about cultural humility versus cultural competence. Same with Catholic intellectual tradition. We can be an example of, but we're not the only example.
Right.
But it's funny because Paulo Freire is not Western.
Right.
And yet he speaks to Foucault, he can speak to Enlightenment, all of that.
So that kind of in itself is kind of where we end up going with this teaching module, is that none of us are going to be able to say, here is the right and here is the wrong, but the goal is to get students to the place where they're comfortable saying, I don't know necessarily what's right for you and what's wrong for you, but also, how do I kind of draw boundaries or put labels on what I truly believe is right and wrong? What are the fundamental values that underlie what I believe human rights should be? So for example, if I'm looking at the UN Code of Human Rights, what is the value in there that I can then apply to any situation, regardless of whether or not it fits into that particular human rights issue? And oftentimes, what the students end up coming to is this kind of belief that each individual should have the right to decide what happens to their body. Period. And if you hold that to be true, then a lot of the other issues kind of melt away from there. So what we're trying to get the students to do is kind of exactly what you're talking about, I think, is coming to this position of being comfortable with not always knowing the answer, and with advocating for each individual's right to have dignity and the ability to kind of name their own lives in a way.
You just keep doing this one, right? All right, thank you. We're waiting for Eric, but I thought what we do is see if there are other questions or concerns that come from the group, and then maybe have a more general conversation on how, right, these are three very different projects. And I don't, some themes are starting to emerge, but I don't know that a solid one. But have some conversations on why this is important for Marymount to be supporting this. This is something that Marymount spends money on, and so that conversation. But I guess first open it up for questions or comments for our panelists. Michael?
Did Jen have a chance to present earlier?
No.
I can present for her. She was working on public health, and she's created a graduate class on public health, and she taught it once in the summers, teaching again in the fall, and so she was looking at models of public health ethics, which is a fairly new field, maybe about 10 years old, at least, in scholarship about it. And so she had a lot of interaction, such that the students in her class had to make a kind of a book, a physical book these days, you know, one of the last physical books we see around here, instead of a virtual book. And then they would pass them around in the class, and people would make comments on the book, and then they would kind of revise it through peer interaction. And they made some interesting progress on directed questions of public health, say like the H1N1 or the SARS, the various, how they approached it. It was before the Ebola thing, but if she does it again, I'm sure that'll be in there. But and we're seeing it right before our eyes. A lot of the ethical issues about putting people in quarantine who show no symptoms and are not contagious. And we were talking about it in one of my classes. Students actually were amazed to think that, if you don't work for 21 days, that might have an impact on your ability to pay your bills and get kicked out of your home and various things. Everyone, I guess maybe from the students' perspective, a lot of our students maybe that's not a practical thing they worry about at this point in their life. And she also is 2 drafts into a paper that she's going to present at the Society for Ethics across the curriculum. So we did 2 of the 3 things, the research, the class, and then perhaps the presentation to a professional organization.
Okay, thank you, Michael. Anything for the panelists?
I have a question for Holly.
Okay.
Please.
We're going to you and then to Chase.
How many students did you have in your class?
It was small because the service scared them away.
Oh.
So I only had 14. I usually have a full 20 in creative writing
14's
classes.
a lot, though.
Yeah, but
For the summer.
it's usually, no, it wasn't a summer class.
Oh, it wasn't a summer class.
No.
Okay.
I did some service the summer before I taught the class in preparation for the class.
Gotcha.
Do they have a specific number of hours of service?
Yeah, they were supposed to do 15, but it didn't always work out. So 12 was kind of the minimum, somewhere between 12 and 15. Some did more, and some got really excited about what they were doing and continued it after the semester was over. Yeah.
Well, and you mentioned one of the struggles was was a lack of infrastructure.
Just getting them
Yeah.
places. There was so much need in South Arlington, and there's no good way to get there. If you take a bus, it takes about an hour one way, and there's no metro. So if students didn't have a car, I tried to drive them, which was crazy. That was crazy. I just can't do it, unfortunately. And we've talked about some kind of, especially if we did a service with all 101 sections, some kind of like South Arlington shuttle or something that could drop people off at service opportunities, maybe 1 or 2 days, afternoons a week. But it's complicated because the service, South Arlington is big, and, the service opportunities are, 15 minutes apart. So it's complicated, unfortunately.
Jason, why don't you go ahead? So I'll say Eric, this is Eric, we'll let you sign in.
My question was for you, actually, so
Good, we're doing better. So Eric, what the other three panelists did was, ramp until you got here. Can I present what they did in the seminar and how that was helpful to them in their teaching or scholarship? So kind of a narrative of what they did through their seminar.
Okay. Well, so the ethics seminar was really, really useful for me, and I was actually surprised at how useful it was. I learned a lot of things, and started applying it to my teaching. I have a lot of, if you don't know, I teach physics, astronomy, physical science. I teach the natural sciences, and a lot of students have difficulty with those classes, even the intro level. Just the material is so different than anything they've approached, and they don't even want to engage with it because it's science, and science is bad. It's scary. So something they can engage with is actually the idea of ethics. They are interested in that, and they can grasp that. So I approach a lot of the science lessons from an ethics perspective. So now I actually took what I learned in that seminar and developed an introductory lesson where we plan a mission to Mars. And we take a bunch of astronaut candidates, and they all have profiles, and they have to pick who they want to send to Mars to fulfill some goals.
Did they ever send you?
I am not one of the candidates, because these candidates are mostly all reprehensible people that have conflicting things. There's the survivalist who guarantees that they'll be able to survive on Mars, but he beats women, allegedly. Okay. There's the guy that's really, really popular, and women really want to watch him on TV, but he has no useful skills. There's the woman who is a genius. She's got a medical degree, she's got a doctorate, she's very well prepared, she studies astrophysics, she's a great candidate, but if you send her, her husband's going to leave her children. Okay? And you're sending these people on a one-way trip. So you're discussing what are the ethics of that. Can we send this mom and her kids are going to be abandoned? Can we even send people one way to Mars? Is that valid to do? Is that ethical? So we get into those kinds of questions. So that's been one useful thing with my teaching. That's a good introductory lesson. It really gets them involved. And then for scholarship, I've started actually looking into the ethics of space settlement. That's becoming a bigger issue now. If you've heard of a man named Elon Musk, does anybody know Elon Musk?
Yeah.
He's a man. He's a billionaire. You heard of eBay?
Oh, yeah.
You heard of eBay?
Right.
That's where he got his money.
Right.
So he is super rich. If you've heard of Tesla Motors,
Right.
that's his.
Right.
He has formed a rocket ship company. Literally, he builds rocket ships and sends things up to the space station. His goal is to get people settled on Mars by 2025. He wants to move to Mars. And he's got the money that he can do it. So this is starting to become a more pressing issue. So I've started to research into the ethics of doing that. There's a variety of different questions, so many different questions. One of the big things I'm looking at now is actually the business ethics of it and how the business comes into play. And if anybody saw last night, did anybody see that they were launching from Virginia?
Yeah.
Yeah. They didn't launch from Virginia, it blew up. So looking at what, was that a good idea to keep doing this? Is that ethical to keep doing this if these things are exploding? Of course, NASA had a good spin on it. Their immediate response was, yeah, it exploded, but nobody was injured. Big explosion, nobody was hurt.
Right.
Our safety things worked.
Where did they launch in Virginia from?
Wallops, near Chincoteague Island, near the wild ponies.
No ponies were injured?
No ponies were injured. We don't.
We don't think.
For now.
There could have been.
Yeah.
They've actually closed a lot of the national parks because some of the stuff that exploded, some of the debris might have
God.
been flying off. Because some of the things that were on the payload were actually classified. Oops. So.
Of course.
Got men in black out there. Stealing stuff. So it's been useful for my teaching and for my research, really engaging the students and giving me something else to look into.
Great, thank you. Jace, you had a question for me, so we're gonna let you go.
I just have a comment about the ethics of space settlement. My daughter, she's 9 years old. She's very concerned about animal welfare, and she has mentioned to me that what's going to happen when the sun burns out. I said, well, when the sun burns out, hopefully human beings have found a different settlement. And then she said, are we taking the animals? I'm not sure.
I hope so.
Space Noah. That's who you're
Right. But I said, even in the space Noah situation, we'll probably picking animals, not taking, all the bugs and bees.
We may end up needing those.
Yeah, no, I mean, we're all so connected. I find it hard to imagine human settlement anywhere without the rest of the stuff.
Kind of, they're supporting ecology.
Yeah.
So we get into environmental ethics there.
Yeah, interesting.
But Nancy, there will be no hockey on Mars. Come to grips.
What are we going to do then? There's always basketball.
There is ice up there, so
There you go.
it's cold.
It's cold, yeah.
All right, Jace, you had a question?
Oh, yeah, actually, the program to go to Mars, that's actually real, though.
Yeah.
Elon Musk has one, and then there's a Dutch company.
People, the company.
Like the television.
Yeah,
That's actually.
that's a real thing.
Yeah.
The astronaut candidates, those are made up. But the idea, I presented to we're going to fund it as a reality show. Is this a good idea to do? Is this ethical to send people to Mars for entertainment purposes? And that's actually what they're doing. They're a Dutch company called Mars One. They are sending people. They got thousands of applications. They're picking their people. They are planning to go in 2024.
Oh my God.
Yeah, and you presented that in the Ethics 1 seminar.
Yeah.
And I was just blown, I thought there was no way that was true, but it was, and you showed the little promo commercial, and it's wild.
The late humorist David Rakoff used to play a version of that at the summer camp, the socialist summer camp in Canada in the 70s called Bomb Shelter.
Yeah.
Where you had to figure out how to come down with you into the bomb shelter.
It's very similar to that.
This is the goal, right? I mean, the broad application of ethics across the curriculum. I mean, even if you don't find a specific theme that runs through each one of those, I mean, this is part of the goal of ethics, right? I mean, so what they're doing is a sign of success of the program as much as anything, right? So
and as I was listening, it was especially I don't have to say too much for the first three presenters, was how much the ethics kind of concerned the marginalized, giving voice to those who don't have a voice, the environment, human rights issues, those that are suffering, and engaging our students in it. What I think is unique for Erickson is you end up with all four of these are trying to engage students more into the subject matter of the class. And that is what I think, that's a challenge for all of us.
Yeah.
And finding a way to do that. And as Sarah said, ethics is a way to do that. They care about that. They don't know much about it. But they know it's important. And to use that as an avenue that if they're doing this in all their classes, then yes, to use your term, that's a success. That means it may not provide an accessible product for SATs, but it demonstrates that we're really using ethics as the hallmark of one of the hallmarks of the university.
Well, it involves complex higher order thinking skills because there is no right and wrong. It's not black and white, right? So you're forcing students to think beyond simple answers.
And I think developmentally, that's often kind of the stage that they're at. They're moving out of that concrete thinking for there's a rule and there's a right and there's a wrong, and into this ability to kind of sit with uncertainty and to still kind of navigate how are you going to move in a goal-oriented direction or a value-oriented direction in that uncertainty.
And I agree. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
No, one of the things to maybe check with all of you, because I think some of us would like to incorporate this into our classroom is, so I teach nursing, and
Right.
we were talking about the importance of ethics committees in hospitals. So I gave them an example pulled up on the website of the New York Times article where a nun was excommunicated by the diocese in Phoenix for serving on an ethics committee and going against the Catholic teachings of the church, where you had one priest in support of her and the other trying to defend. So it went well. I talked to them about how important this was to really just think about the importance of ethics committees, and when you come up against what maybe against Catholic Church, it was uncomfortable. I presented it. I tried to get them to talk about, some are not Catholic or not, and so any advice from people in the room, because as nurses, again, we do deal with, some of us will go to work. The Catholic Church is a big delivery of healthcare in this country, and so what that means for us as professionals in those situations. And again, it wasn't about right or wrong,
Right.
But seeing even within the Catholic Church, there was a disagreement. But any suggestions you can have, because I think that's, sometimes I think
Yeah.
people want to speak, and then it's, I'm afraid to offend my colleagues.
Yeah, no, it's tricky. I teach race, and that's really tricky. Depends on the class to get them talking.
And the same thing happens for history. If you're talking about slavery and
Yep.
there are African American students in the class, most of the other students are going to be very, very reluctant
Right.
to speak.
And I can just see my white students like shifting uncomfortably.
Yeah.
Like, we're not racist. That's not our problem. And it sometimes.
about this?
Right. It's not a problem anymore. We have a black president. We're post-racist.
Or even I don't want to say the wrong thing. I don't
Or
know
yes,
what the right
yes.
terminology is.
Yes, or
I
I'm
don't
gonna
know.
look like a racist if
Right,
I say something. Yeah, so I think grounding the conversation in literary text helps me. So we can kind of deflect and talk about the characters or what's happening in the text. That kind of helps. Projecting. And you have this case study. So if you're giving them like the conversation, some pieces of that conversation, sometimes that kind of helps, to deflect, rather than talking about your personal beliefs. We're not going to talk about your personal beliefs. We're going to talk about the issues and what these other people have said, and which arguments are they making from a health care perspective. Maybe, I don't know. It doesn't always work, and it depends on the class, right?
Yeah,
Some
definitely.
classes it just bombs horribly when I try to talk about issues of race and social justice and things like that. In other classes, it's just like they can't stop talking. So, and I don't always know why or how or what's going to happen.
The personality of the faces of the moon.
So I'm teaching TRF 100, so I don't teach the upper level TRS ethics courses, but one thing to remember, I think, in terms of Catholic stuff is our students all will have some experience while they're at Marymount of learning a little bit about Christianity and learning a little about ethics, but they might not have had that yet. So there's points where they're going to be at different points in their development. But I think as we are a minority Catholic student body, and of those students, most of them have not been in a church since they were 6 years old.
Yeah.
So I think that's the other thing, is to not, I would think of more case studies that are more abstract might be an easier way to bring that conversation than trying to get to understand the real stories, just because it's just not something that's on their radar. They've never heard of Catholic principles in social justice or life stuff, except maybe from a
Except for the few students who are like, die hard like doctrine, because we even have those in the English department, and I got reamed on an evaluation once because like I didn't know about some kind of Catholic literary teaching or something like that. I was like, what? So, this student was all about dogma and was very uncomfortable with pushing that. So you do have that here more than you would at other places. So yeah, that is going to be an issue. I try not to worry about it too much because part of my job is to make them uncomfortable and get them over dogma, but yeah.
And I think to Angel's point before of recognizing where our students are developmentally, the mistake I make is that I assume my students are at the same developmental stage that I was at their age.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And they're not.
Yeah.
So when you say get them over dogma, some of them are not
They're- yep.
developmentally ready for that.
That's right. That's right.
And then in between. So I did this, in one of my classes, I asked them, what are the perennial questions? I said, what are the questions you stay up at night and talk about with your friends? And they stare at it. They don't.
They don't.
No.
They don't. It hasn't been part of their culture. And I think they will. I do. I think they will.
Oh, gosh.
They're going to do it in their mid-20s.
I still don't do it.
I don't know.
I don't know either.
Like the whole concept of free speech alley is just, when I was in college, you just got out there and you spoke your mind, whatever issue it was, and people would gather around. That whole concept is just completely foreign. When I tell them about it, they just stare at me like I'm from maybe from Mars.
But I do think it's kind of a shift because I teach only graduate students and they are much more in that zone.
Yeah.
And it might just be kind of my program too, the forensic psychology, and that's kind of their jam is like these issues,
Yeah.
But after class, they'll still be down in the lobby just debating
Talking about
something
these
that we
things,
talked
yeah.
about in class. So it might just be a developmental stage or something, yeah.
Hi, I'm Matt Shadle. So speaking of developmental stages, so I actually teach ethics. So part of that is the shift from authority and dogma to questioning, but the stage that's in between is just everybody just has their opinion. Right? That's the first stage of questioning
Yes.
authority. Is that's just their opinion, I have
Yes.
mine. And that, to me, that's actually more of a challenge to move them from that to yes, everyone has an opinion, but back yours up. Right? That's more of a challenge, I think. Because I was in the previous session that what he was just teaching. The comments was about how students have like these stock generalities that they'll put in a paper, and it was about like having a tag that you can just put every time someone does that, so you don't have to type it out. Like, oh, please don't say that. Right? For him, it was since the beginning of time. I was joking with Kathleen that one of ours would be religion means many different things for many different people.
Right.
But teaching ethics, it is everybody has their opinion about what's right.
Yes.
And like, well, that's great, but just justify yours. Right?
A similar kind of debate came up in one of my classes. We were talking about interrogational torture and whether or not you. I know most of us are like, oh gosh, no, terrible. But a lot of my students are very kind of pro law enforcement, pro national security. But a lot of them were like, I don't know if psychologists want to help aid in the development of torture techniques, then that's up to them, and that's kind of their own ethical concern. And they're all just like, whatever. And I said, all right, well, what if that was your job and you decided how to torture somebody to maybe get information? And then they were just like, I don't know if I could do that. And it's like, well, you have to represent your field here. You kind of have to take a stand at some point for a lot of different things, and that's where they get more uncomfortable, is having to take a stand.
I teach multicultural education, whatever, and racism and all that, whatever. And I'm teaching them the professional definition and whatever. And in order to get to the place that I want them to be, there's this little known series of 18 phases where then you become interculturally more mature, right? And this little exercise is so good. They do it online and anonymously, so no one else has to read their stuff. And you go through each one of the key words: belonging, ambiguity, outside, uncomfortable. And Kushner gives a little example, like I was doing this and among Chinese people, and I did my American thing, and then they have to just write. And I don't correct spelling mistakes, whatever. Have you ever been in a situation where you thought what you were supposed to do was hug someone, and whatever? And they do it in three. There's 3 steps to it. So after they write those things, then when we talk about race, they can talk about belonging, not belonging, outside group, inside group, ambiguity, rejection. And then they're more receptive to, white people don't think about this until age 14, and then they feel guilty. Oh, but black people are already thinking about this at age 10, and they feel anger, And then, of course, films, it's It's a class. I don't make them read anything about King Henry VIII and his torture, whatever, but I show a snippet of a film. You know, my favorite one, the world's fastest Indian, which is not about Native Americans, it's about a motorcycle. But it's just a film where this guy from New Zealand is here in the United States trying to race the fastest, which he did. Okay, broke the sound barrier, whatever. Just a little snippet where everyone thinks he's weird and whatever, and don't, you know, and where a snippet where he doesn't belong, or then they have to bring in less than 5 minutes of a film that exemplifies one of those 18 words. You know, and the films they bring in, you know.
So you sort of
5 minutes.
Yeah, you sort of defamiliarize that typical racism conversation, and you kind of take the judgment out of it, so they're
right, and that's why I do
more able to talk about it.
Because he's old, he's from New Zealand, he's got a motorcycle which doesn't meet any of the regulations. He comes here and he hasn't signed up and whatever. So you know, we can talk about these issues without the racism issue, and the fact that it's a true story. He broke the sound barrier, and you know, whatever. Anyway, so just having a venue for them to be able to say, oh yeah, well there was a time where I was on a bus and this happened and, you know, nobody liked me and blah, 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 or I forgot to bring my deodorant and then, you know, finally someone said you stink. Or the things they come up with where they belonged or were rejected or didn't, you know, and then we talk about institutional racism.
Okay, so I want to thank everybody for attending. I especially thank our panelists for their hard work and for sharing with us. There's lunch in the cafeteria now. I think we're in the back section, so I think it might be covered for you. And there are evaluations here at the end that Jason is asking for people to fill out. But thank you to our panelists.